I am the manager of data analytics and special projects for LBG Canada. When I was asked to put this together and talk a little bit about the LBG Canada program, I grabbed a screenshot from our website because it's got a couple of things on there that I think are really interesting. The first is what we try to do, and that's to tell a better story. And the way we do that is by measuring community impact. We allow the measurement to inform the decision-making that companies make and to strengthen community partnerships. We also measure impact and help companies explain that. So fundamentally, the LBG Canada group is about the companies within it. My job primarily is to take this large pool of data that people give me and to distill it down into individual insights and trend reporting so that people can kind of see what's going on in the marketplace as well as what's going on with their individual organization specifically. I commit one of the cardinal sins of PowerPoint here in putting a ton of text on some of the slides. So at the end of this, if anybody would like the presentation, please just let me know and I'll send it to you. No need to try to read the whole thing because I'm sure not going to. I'm going to split this into two kind of parts. Today I'm going to talk about community investment from a company perspective primarily, and tomorrow I'm going to speak a little bit more towards stakeholder engagement, so employee giving and volunteering programs and how you can engage your employees a little bit better in those kind of spaces. So the first thing I kind of wanted to talk about from a highest level perspective is that over the last 10 years, roughly 35 companies have contributed $3 billion worth of time and cash, program management cost, as well as in-kind donations to the community, which is a pretty substantial amount. If you wrap stakeholder contributions in the form of giving, as well as external funds, that amount jumps up to $4 billion. So if 35 companies are putting that much into the marketplace, you can only imagine what the entire world is putting in. Drilling down a little bit, in my particular data set this year, just a couple of highlights. I saw half of companies investing globally and in almost every single continent. The only one that wasn't represented was Australia in this particular data set, so I found that pretty interesting. If you look in the bottom right there, you see that community investment year over year kind of dipped a little bit, but we do have over 40% of companies projecting budget stability, with only 30% of companies projecting a budget decrease for the following year. So there's some pretty positive signs that we're going to see a rebound coming up. 2015 and 2016 were kind of tough years, generally speaking, economically in Canada, so that's pretty understandable. One of the things that I do with all of this data is I provide we at LBG Canada provide each company with an insights and opportunities report that summarizes their audit from a what did you put into the community perspective, as well as provide specific insights regarding what their stakeholder contribution leverage ratios were, how their impact in the community has changed year over year, or what some of their more qualitative things are doing from a quantitative perspective. Now, getting into a little bit of the nitty-gritty, which I'm going to try to not get too weird about, you notice year over year that companies seem to be achieving an increased amount of their impact with in-kind goods and volunteering. But you also see that the program management cost portion at the top keeps shrinking. Giving goods and allowing your employees to volunteer takes an increased amount of resources. So really what we're seeing across the LBG Canada group is people doing more and achieving a greater impact with less resources. Please. Right on. So every sector within the LBG Canada group kind of invests in the community a little bit differently. You see large program management costs in a couple of the sectors themselves because of the kind of work that they do. Now, you notice that telecommunications and retail both have high proportions of in-kind goods and higher proportions of program management costs to match up with that. The other place where you see that a little bit is credit unions, but because of the size of the footprint of them, it's not excessively surprising that they have higher management costs for their programs. But you are starting to see, generally speaking, a larger amount of in-kind year on year from each individual company. There was a fairly sharp jump from 2015 to 2016 due to some companies investing massive amounts into the community, but even if I wipe that out, the trend remained the same. In that 56% of companies saw an increase of in-kind, 40% in time, and 24% of companies saw both increasing. And again, these things are labor intensive, but they can enhance the corporate reputation by giving the communities exactly what they need, which is something that I've heard a lot of you talk about today. Talk about giving with a more personal connection, whereas cash, as we've talked about, doesn't really have that. The other thing that it can contribute to is employee engagement, which is something we'll touch on a little bit later from a specific Loyalty One perspective. Again, as I touched on before, expected budget changes year on year. 2015 was really tough. 52% of companies projected a decrease in their budget. Well, actually 64% of them saw that decrease, which is why the increase in in-kind and time is so important. It allows them to still achieve a little bit more impact without spending as much money. And another reason that all of the things that you've been talking about today are important is when we talk about why do your budgets go up, well, increased profit's a pretty trivial factor to think about. If you have more money, you can spend more money. But a greater internal appreciation of the value of community investment was strongly correlated with impact measurement as well as employee engagement factors. So if you can more clearly explain to people why what you're doing has value, you're more likely to see more resources to achieve that. The work that Gabby and Stephanie spoke about earlier is reflected in the charts before you. On the left is their previous approach, where it's just all kinds of different focus areas and organizations that they were investing in. And on the right is a much more targeted theme towards marginalized and disadvantaged youth. And what that's allowed for is very focused investments into the community to achieve exactly the impact that they're looking for. When you start to talk about community investment, it doesn't just come from the CSR department or from a community investment department. The proportion of companies that report investments from other departments is pretty staggering, where 45% of companies are reporting contributions from regional offices. But the more surprising thing to me is that the marketing department is actually responsible for a lot of contributions themselves. Maybe that's just because I'm new, but that kind of shocked me. The other thing that we're starting to see year over year is that more and more companies are spending money on regionally identified priorities. So that's either because corporate is listening to the regions and investing there, or because there's a greater spend from the regions themselves. So the budgets of regional offices are going up. The other thing that we're starting to see is that companies are using their stakeholder contributions. And again, there's a lot of words, so don't try to read all of those. I can send it to you later if you like. But companies are using their stakeholder contributions in the form of employee giving or leveraging external funds to increase their impact in the community, even though their budgets are decreasing. The example that I speak about here, some of the companies that I looked at would have experienced a 7% decrease in their community impact until you started to see the increase in their stakeholder contributions. So instead of dropping by 7%, they actually increased their impact by 9% in the community. How did they do that? Well, 40% of them leveraged their employees to contribute greater amounts of funds into the community. And those that did so saw an increase in 25% of the contributions made by their employees. Those that looked at external stakeholders, such as governments or their customers or suppliers, saw the contribution of that rise by 60%, which is wild. 60% is a massive increase. It's important to talk about stakeholders, and again, we'll do a little bit more of that tomorrow, because 93% of companies that I work with, we work with, are reporting some form of leverage in the form of supplier and government funds or employee giving and volunteering. Employee giving and volunteering actually have never been higher, with over 86% of people reporting employee giving programs and 82% reporting employee non-working hours programs. But this somewhat confusing chart shows you that corporations typically do one or the other well. They either leverage from their internal stakeholders or their external stakeholders, with 56% of corporations getting 100% of their community contributions from one or the other. So there seems to be a lack of an ability to do both well. And again, those that do leverage from external stakeholders well may be missing a massive opportunity with their employee giving programs. I talked about the fact that there have been $1 billion worth of investment by stakeholders over the past 10 years, with $334 million of that has come in the form of employee contributions to communities, with roughly $94 million being matched. LoyaltyOne has done an unbelievable job in engaging their stakeholders. Similar corporation sizes to LoyaltyOne have employee engagement rates of about 45% for their during working hours programs, whereas their participation has never been lower than 86% in the entire time they've been with LBG Canada. It's a testament to how well their program is working and how great the choices they've made are. I heard a lot of people talk about fluff and how fluffy what we do is and how there's no way to explain return on investment. Well, one of the things that an intern and I did this summer was we went back 10 years and looked at investments into program management teams and tried to see if there was a way to connect that to external stakeholder or internal stakeholder contributions. What we found is that for every dollar invested in program management costs in the form of salaries or training, things like that, we saw an average return of $1.50 in employee giving or in stakeholder contributions of another form. And we found that this was an extremely strong statistical relationship in that it held for every single year or every subset of years. That's a lot of words to say that spending money on your stakeholder team or your community investment team is not a waste. It will actually return more than an investment directly into the community in the form of employee engagement. The other thing that we see is that internal and external stakeholders both respond to multi-year investments. So the greater proportion of a company's budget that was committed to long-term partnerships, the more that they were able to leverage from their external stakeholders. And now I know this graph is kind of spread out and all over the place, but on any level of magnification in that bottom left corner, the relationship holds the exact same way. And that's all I really have to talk about. I'm happy to answer any questions regarding the data itself, or if there are larger questions regarding methodology.
What is the one question that you've had from every single company in the past 6 months?
We're spending a lot of money on our program management costs. Can you help me justify either maintaining my current team size or increasing my team size?
And so what we've tried to do, what we've found is that when you go as an individual or an individual team to have that conversation in your internal strategic forum, whatever that is, only being able to present your reality and leaving that reality out there for the decision making tends to make it become very subjective rather than objective. One of the things that we lovingly nurture amongst the LBG Canada companies is a tremendous sense of competitiveness, because nobody actually likes to know that they're on the low end of the scale. So, I think one of the things that Bryan didn't share, for example, is a little bit more detail about the multi-year investment. One of the things that we're seeing amongst our companies is that during tough economic times, it's actually very difficult to get a senior leader to sign off on a multi-year commitment. And yet that same senior leadership team values the ability to bring stakeholders in to partner, like government or suppliers or whatever. And so if you're actually able to show that you're more likely to achieve your objective of stakeholder partnerships when you're making a multi-year commitment, then that decision to act or not act gets moved to a different level of conversation. The last example I'll share is one of my favorites, to be quite honest, because we've watched it over a number of years, 10 years now, I guess. One of the things that we try to do with this data is to help teams improve their governance processes. And we find it's usually not the team that has bad governance processes. We find it's usually a euphoric senior leader who meets someone that they can't say no to, and all of a sudden there's a proportion of the budget that's gone, or if it's off focus, and the end result is that they have to report on return on investment against a decision that's off message, not on strategy, and didn't fit their decision making model. So one of the things we get companies to estimate is the proportion of decision making that is made outside a routine process. It's a very simple question. But it's amazing the internal reaction when you put together a benchmarking frame, and the company, all the company's data is completely confidential. So if we were on I was one large financial institution and you're another one, we would never be able to know what the other one's was. But I would be able to see my data as compared to a sector pool or a size pool, or we can split it in a whole number of employees. And if my routine process is estimated to be at 45% or more, which you'd be surprised how many companies are, and their peers are hovering at like 15%, maybe 10% or less, which we would say best practice, there's a certain sort of fact of life reality around meeting people that are important but might be a little bit off theme. It's amazing how the companies that are 45% one year, when they have those internal conversations and the senior leaders have to go, oops, I guess that's our impact on our ability to report on a return on investment and measure impact. Those trends will actually change over time. So what we're trying to do is empower the community investment teams to go in with a data-driven focus to support some very important strategic conversations about where the organization's going and what might be the best decision or course correction based on the experience of the team within the organization. So we sandwiched it, data to data.
Okay. I just had a really quick question about multi-sector partnerships and whether you have any examples of measuring the transaction costs that would be inherent to that type of navigation, and whether it perhaps might fall under a broader category such as project management or some sort of process management. The physical cost of coming together, perhaps those individuals or resources that are allocated in order to move the partnership forward.
So right now we would say partially, because one of the challenges that we have is that companies tend to define key elements differently. So my program management cost might just be my salaries and overhead, but your program management cost would also include the investment that you've made to enable this partnership. And so, to be quite honest, what we try to do in our work is to get people to really think about the definitions of the terms, because if people understand that a program management cost definition could be greater than salaries and overheads, then they will actually start tracking that information. Oftentimes, it's sort of relegated to an administrative cost, whereas we would actually argue that that's part of your investment in community, and so it actually should be celebrated rather than criticized as a potential administrative cost. So the answer is partially, not as well as we'd like to, but as multi-sectoral partnerships are becoming more important, I'm sure that we will develop that over time. Yeah. Anybody else?
How's that? The graph tracking the relationship between, I guess, CSR department or team investment and then stakeholder contributions back?
Yeah.
And we called that a ROI, so maybe that's a community ROI, and that it generated $1.50 of contributions from stakeholders. Have you done any correlations between community contributions or team contributions and the other functional areas like revenue or profitability or staff turnover or anything like that?
So staff turnover is not something that we really measure. It's difficult to get an organization to report from a strict sense on turnover. Profitability and contributions as a proportion of revenue really varies independently. So I haven't found one thing that ties what the size of contribution is from a proportion of revenue or proportion of pre-tax profit quite yet. And I think there's two reasons for that. One, no two people in this room are going to use the same definition for pre-tax profit, right? And you can go grab 5 accountants and you'll get 6 opinions on what that actually is. And the other thing is that a lot of the corporations that we work with are publicly traded, but it's difficult for them to release that kind of information because they're multinationals. So how do we know exactly what was spent in Canada versus the remainder of the world? It's tough. We do see some leadership from some of the companies in the space. Like, there's a lot of credit unions and other, I guess, what is the right way to put them? Cooperatives that lead with extremely high proportion or contributions to the proportion of pre-tax profit. So you'll see contributions as high as 7 or 8% in a lot of those spaces. On the other hand, it can be kind of difficult to make that argument in a larger, more shareholder-focused place. So
There's probably a wild number of variables to normalize in a question like that.
Yeah, it's so big that I haven't found one way to write an equation that gives me something that isn't just nonsense.